Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for coming out back to the Hilltop and to SMU and the Center for Presidential History. It's good to see you again, especially on such a beautifully warm and blustery night. Our guest, as you may know, is from Canada. I will allow you to take out your penance on the cold against him for having brought it with him. This is really a heartwarming and special event for us at the Center and for me personally. As you have heard me say before, one of the crown jewels in our Center for Presidential History litany of programs is our postdoctoral program. It's the one which I think is actually perhaps arguably the one that is going to leave the greatest impact upon the world, where we bring the top scholars, recent PhDs primarily from around the country who are studying American presidency in some form or fashion. I'm often asked, what is the definition of studying the American presidency? I say, anything that involves federal power, period. So pretty broad. So they're basically the best people from around the country, and we usually get about 65, 70 applicants for these coveted 2 slots. And they are afforded 2 years here where they can research and contribute to our community and contribute to our collective memory project, oral history of the George W. Bush life and times of his administration. And then the real thing that we do for them is give them the opportunity to mature their thinking, in a sense, and rework their first important text, their first book, and help them get a leg up on the job market. Now, you've heard me say before, the job market in history is appalling. That is probably too complimentary to the market. But the whole program, the whole idea is to give people, young scholars, the opportunity to think and flourish and thereby go out and influence the world not only with their scholarship but also with their teaching. And I like to point out that, if you have an average person go to a large university who is teaching 600 people a year, well, you can imagine the multiplier effect that our influence upon those people have, especially after they've gotten their ability to teach or opportunity to teach and experience teaching here at SMU. All of which is to say, this is the program that makes me the most proud. And this is a particularly proud moment because this is the first time that one of ours has come back. One of ours has done exactly everything he was supposed to. Tim Sayle, who came to us from Temple University, actually his graduate advisor was a mentor of mine as well. And when I saw his application, I wrote it up and said, surely this guy isn't that good. And he said, he just wrote me back 2 words, hire him. So we did, and never been happier. Tim Sayle came to us from Temple and then went to the University of Toronto, which I would argue is the single best job. That's our associate director, in case you're wondering, who didn't turn off his phone. I would argue University of Toronto was the single best job available on the market that year, and Tim got it, which is handy because he's from Toronto. So that was rather convenient. And he did 2 amazing things while he was here. The first is work on his first book, Enduring Alliance, A History of NATO. You may have heard that NATO was, in the news the last week. I assure you, this is not me just saying it because I'm a big fan of Tim personally, and I can encourage you to look at all the reviews that have come out about this book. If you want to know the real history of NATO, this is the one that policymakers are reading. This is really the top-notch book on this. So I'm sure copies were passed around, all around the last NATO conference, whether somebody had a hot mic or not. In addition, Tim, while he was here, was really, I think, one of the driving forces behind one of our biggest projects, which, of course, was our oral history of George W. Bush's decision to surge troops in Iraq in 2005, 2006, 2007. He is listed as one of the 4 co-authors on this book. If we were really being honest with ourselves, there would only be one, which is Tim. It would not have happened without him. And so it just gives me the utmost pleasure, now that he has gone out into the world, done good for yourself, and come back with a book in tow, for me to introduce our former postdoc, close to our hearts always, Professor Tim Sayle.
Thanks so much, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be back here at SMU. As Jeff said, I usually came here to warm up from Toronto, but we're at about equal temperatures right now. It's a treat to be back, and to be back and to see how the Center for Presidential History has grown. There's an incredible team of postdocs here. Jeff, you've done an amazing job, and I know you've done it with Brian Franklin and Ronna Spitz, so thanks to them for bringing me here today. As Jeff mentioned, part of my time here was working on this project, this history of NATO. And the more military and diplomatic records that I read, the more I became convinced that the history of the alliance, going back to the 1940s, could help us understand international relations today, and especially the fears and concerns of our leaders, NATO's leaders, when they look at the future of international relations. Because I think since the end of the Second World War, leaders in Western Europe, in Canada, and the United States have feared most one thing, which is the return of general war. Lots of bad things have happened in the world. Many bad things could happen, but by far the worst, of course, would be a general war in the nuclear age. And this makes sense. No one wants a third world war. But the riddle for me was trying to understand why leaders thought war might come again and how they thought they had prevented it. And I think that the NATO leaders during the Cold War really did believe they were preventing and had prevented a return to general war. When these men, and they were all men at the beginning of NATO, looked to the future, to future policy to try and keep the peace in Europe, what they did was look to the past. To understand the Cold War, and today we need to understand that our policymakers really looked to the First and the Second World War when they were making policy for the Cold War. And these men were really literally and physically shaped by the wars of the past. I'll just give you a few examples here. Training for the D-Day invasion. You can see General Dwight Eisenhower there shivering against the cold. He, of course, is going to be the supreme commander of Allied expeditionary forces. The chap in the jaunty beret is General, later Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. And Montgomery would command Allied ground forces from D-Day on in Europe. So here are these two men, 1944, in advance of D-Day. These two men back in 1951, when NATO's command structure is formed. Eisenhower is NATO's supreme Allied commander. Montgomery is his deputy supreme Allied commander. These are the men who planned and fought the Allied offensives of the Second World War, are the men who built NATO's command structure. And it goes on and on. Let me show you two other pictures. Two gentlemen in good British Guards regiments from the First World War. It's Anthony Eden on the left and Harold Macmillan on the right. Both men would go on to be MPs and major opponents of appeasement in the late 1930s. Both men would go on to be prime ministers, of course. There's Eden with Eisenhower, Macmillan with Kennedy. They had seen war, but they'd seen it in particularly important ways. Macmillan, on the right, had been shot in the pelvis during the First World War, spent a night in no man's land between the trenches, waiting to be rescued. And he obviously survived. In the Second World War, he was a civilian, but not immune from danger. He was in a plane crash. He ran back into the plane to save some of his junior officials. And legend has it that his trademark mustache burned with a blue flame. So I don't know if all mustaches burn with a blue flame, but his did. But luckily it grew back. It was sort of one of his trademark features. But when these men in their suits later are talking about international policy in the midst of the Cold War, underneath those suits is real scar tissue from these wars. And I'll give you one more example. Of course, Kennedy had his own serious and quite painful experiences in the Second World War. But back to the war, back to D-Day actually. This is General Maxwell Taylor preparing to jump into Normandy in advance of D-Day. And down here, on the far right is Erwin Rommel, Nazi commander, and his chief of staff, Hans Spiegel. It's a quirk of fate that Rommel was away from the front on D-Day, and so Spiegel would actually coordinate the defense of Normandy. Okay, so Nazi officer. Zoom forward to the JFK administration. There's Maxwell Taylor, president's military advisor and then chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. There's Spiegel, now commander of NATO ground forces in Allied Europe, serving under an American officer, Supreme Allied Commander then Loris Norstad. So these men had seen war. Some of them had even seen war against each other. And I could go on to show you individual after individual, decade after decade, who'd had their lives filled with war. And that's how they thought about international relations. Their lives had been filled with war, and they did not think that war had simply disappeared or that war would disappear after the Second World War simply because war was awful or war was unwanted. They did not think that peace was the natural order of things. And some of you may know the line from the book of Isaiah that says, "They shall beat their swords into plowshares." Right? This idea that disarmament could lead to peace. And these men fundamentally disagreed with that notion. They would have quoted this other ancient Roman writer who said, "If you want peace, prepare for war." And so NATO's goal was to prevent war, but it sought to achieve this by preparing for war. And over the last 70 years then, from the origins of the North Atlantic Treaty in 1949, there has been no general war in Europe. There have been awful wars around the world, but we haven't had a world war. And the reason for this, according at least to the presidents and the prime ministers who maintained NATO, believed that it was the alliance itself that had prevented the war. So what is this NATO? How did it work? When I say NATO, it's this North Atlantic Treaty Organization formed out of a treaty between 12 states in 1949. For most of the Cold War, it would have 15 members. Today, NATO has 29. Next year, it will have 30 members. It involves this treaty promise between the allies to come to each other's aid in case of conflict. But it's more than that. It also includes a whole military command structure organized to bring the military force of all of these states to bear together. What I was trying to do in the book and what I'm going to do tonight is to try and explain just how NATO governments became convinced this alliance was necessary, how they maintained it during the Cold War, and why they thought it needed to continue and to grow after the end of the Cold War. Now, I have to leave out a number of chapters of the book. I'm not going to talk about the French challenge to NATO, not the current president, Emmanuel Macron, but the last time a French president tried to challenge NATO in public, Charles de Gaulle in the 60s. And Emmanuel Macron's suggestion recently that NATO was brain dead, and some of his arguments about the alliance really mirror the French situation in the 1960s. So amazing continuity there. And my book goes on to spend more time on the military strategy and planning for crises like the Berlin crisis. But as I said, there's three things I want to touch on today as an arc: the creation of the alliance, the challenges of maintaining a nuclear alliance in a world in which nuclear weapons are not popular, to say the least, and how NATO adapted at the end of the Cold War. The core of my argument in the book, and that I will connect, which I will use to connect these three themes, is that leaders after the Second World War saw the ingredients of international relations differently from decades and centuries past. They still believe that military force, armies, tanks, nuclear missiles now could shape how states related to each other, but they were now dealing with a new factor, something much, much more significant in terms of international relations, which was the power of people. NATO was a response to diplomacy in an age of democracy. These leaders thought state power was important, but they also believed people power was important. The power of people to vote, the power of people to pressure their governments, and the fact that people power, what people think and what they ask their governments to do, can be manipulated by the fear of war. So the story really begins in the mid-1940s, at the end of the Second World War. It's a map here showing American, British, French, and other troops pressing east, and the Red Army pressing west. These armies will meet, of course, in Germany after defeating Hitler's Nazi empire. And it was a victory. It was a victory, of course. But it's easy to forget that victories after such a war are grim and gruesome. Right? In Europe, after the war, on top of the millions dead, were 50 million refugees. There were full cities destroyed. Dresden, Warsaw, Vienna, flattened. And you can see the devastation in these pictures, but what we can't see is the smell. We can't smell what one American diplomat called that sickening sweet odor of burned flesh that permeated the post-war cities of the dead. Right? Europe was destroyed. And the people that remained, so many of them refugees, people in France, people in the Netherlands, they were fearful of their future and they were starving. And all of this led to questions about just what would happen once those occupying armies left. And indeed, most of the American, British, and Canadian troops did leave Western Europe, except for Germany, but the Soviets stayed in Eastern Europe. And so in Eastern Europe, in the states shown here, the Soviets helped establish governments, Moscow-friendly governments, that coordinated their foreign and defense policies with Moscow. They started implementing this Soviet order in the East. But in the West, in West Europe, there was no victory, there was of course victory, but there was no safety, and there was very little order. And American and British officials feared that the famine, the disease, the starvation, the lack of any standard of living would only increase the appeal of communism in the West. And it's a sad truth that capitalism and liberal democracy just don't offer convincing plans for starting a society from scratch. They require time, they require capital. But the Soviets, on the other hand, could promise all of this state-directed industry, all of this state-directed rebuilding. And it was proving to be a more and more attractive model for those people in the West who had nothing. So the issue is not so much ideological as it is one of political power. Worry that communist parties in Western Europe are going to come to power, even by elections, by people hearing the siren song of state-backed recovery, and that if more governments in Western Europe, say in France or in Italy, elect communist governments, they will link up with the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union will have great influence throughout the whole continent. Right? So it's this fear, not of the Soviets invading the rest of Europe, but coming to dominate the rest of Europe through elections, through political conquest, that worried Washington and London so much. And in fact, we can take this out of the Cold War. We can see how in the past, the possibility of one state taking over all of Europe had led to war before. Right? This is why the English had fought Louis XIV, if we want to go back that far. This is why the British had fought Napoleon. This is why the British entered the First World War when the German armies moved through Belgium and came close to controlling the Channel coast. And this is why the British and then later the Americans had rallied to defeat Hitler and ensure that Germany did not control the continent. So this is the fear. This is the fear of political conquest. The first solution to this plan was the Marshall Plan, which you will have heard of, named for Secretary of State George Marshall, announced it in a speech at Harvard. The theory was that if the United States, through enormous and incredible benevolence, could help jumpstart the economies of Europe, people's standard of living would rise and they wouldn't be attracted to the communist parties. But by late 1947, the British Foreign Secretary, Ernest Bevin, been a member of Churchill's cabinet, he's a part of the Labour government, but certainly anti-communist, worries that if the standard of living rises, that still won't be enough to prevent Soviet influence in Western Europe. And there's three things that happened in the 1940s that caused him to think there needed to be a political and military solution, that the Marshall Plan as an economic solution wasn't enough. And the first one of these events is in Finland, right at the end of the Second World War. Finland had been invaded by the Soviet Union. Finland had been ravaged by war. And at the end of the war, with the Soviets victorious and the Nazis defeated, Moscow essentially made Finland an offer they couldn't refuse. Right? It's like organized crime. They said, let us direct your foreign and defense policy, give up a part of your territory, and you can survive as a country. That was the deal. The people of Finland, exhausted by war, the Finnish government, knowing their people were exhausted and had no will to mobilize, to fight again, conceded to this agreement with the Soviet Union. So there'd already been one case of the Soviets making such an offer. And in 1947, the Soviets were preparing to make a similar offer to Norway. Norway, too, had been invaded, this time by the Nazis. Norway had a very bad war. And this offer coming to Norway was extremely alarming. But the Norwegians did something very smart. They raised the alarm. They told American diplomats, British diplomats, and Canadian diplomats that this offer was coming. This offer from the Soviet Union to give up territory and to coordinate policies was coming. And this raised alarm bells in those other capitals because Hitler, by taking over Norway, had gained access to the North Atlantic in a way that was very dangerous to the British and to North America. And this is what generates in Bevin's mind, in late 1947, the idea that states of North America and Western Europe should come together in some sort of Atlantic pact so that no single state should have to face a request from the Soviets alone. And then just the final proof in the pudding occurred in Czechoslovakia in 1948 with the Prague coup. Bevin had already shared his idea for an Atlantic pact, and this crisis in 1948 sealed the deal in a way. There was an uprising in Prague when Czech communists rose up. It wasn't Soviet troops, it was Czechoslovak communists who rose up, they were armed, and installed a communist-friendly government in Czechoslovakia. And the American and British intelligence officials were convinced that these communists had only resorted to this coup because they believed the Soviet Union would back them in case of trouble. Czechoslovakia is another successful example of the Soviets using what was called salami tactics, just slicing off a little bit of Europe at a time. And Czechoslovakia was important because it lay in the heart of Europe, of course, but it was also one of the lands that had been fed to Hitler as part of the appeasement policy, right? And so many of these men who believed that appeasing Hitler in the late 1930s was a mistake now wondered if appeasement was happening again in 1948. Just to draw some modern parallels, we've seen something similar happen just in the last decade, right? In Crimea, part of Ukraine, suddenly in 2014, some soldiers with no insignia, not clear who they were, officially anyway, showed up in Crimea, helped take control of the Crimean parliament, and helped to install a new prime minister there in that part of Ukraine. That new pro-Russian prime minister, who these men had helped into power, then led this council in Ukraine to have a vote of independence from Ukraine, and then a vote to join Russia. Right? We know, of course, that these men were Russian special operations troops, but Russia has presented everything that happened in Crimea in 2014 on as a democratic act of Crimeans choosing through a vote to leave Crimea, or to leave Ukraine and to join Russia. Right? So it's not a forceful invasion. It was, as the Russians would say, just simply democracy at work, and it's changed part of the map in Europe. But back to the 1940s, back to Bevan again. These events in Finland, Norway, Czechoslovakia, all seem to indicate that the Soviets were trying to take over more and more of Europe. And the problem for Bevan, in his words, was that the Russians seemed to be fairly confident of getting the fruits of war without going to war. Right? That the Russians thought and were making gains without having to fight for them. Bevan says, if this went unchecked, and again his words, it would be to repeat our experience with Hitler and to witness helplessly the slow deterioration of our position until we, meaning the British and the Americans, are forced to resort to war in order to defend our lives and liberty. So what Bevan's saying is really important, and it's really remarkable. He's arguing that the balance of power in Europe could change without war, but could change so drastically that the Americans and the British might find themselves compelled to fight their way back onto the continent as they had just done. So how to avoid this? How to avoid this? Well, Czechoslovakia, as I said, gives a major boost to Bevan's idea of a pact. American, British, and Canadian diplomats meet in Washington for a super secret meeting to talk about this idea of an alliance. It was extremely secret to most, except for the Soviets, because one of the British diplomats was a spy. So the Soviets knew this was all happening. But those ABC powers, those three, end up inviting several other Western European allies to come, and they sign the North Atlantic Treaty, the Washington Treaty, in 1949, creating NATO. And the whole goal, this is NATO in 1954, the foreign ministers in Paris, the whole goal was to ensure that not one of these states had to stand alone against requests from the Soviet Union. I want to put this another way, drawing in this idea of the balance of power, right? Because NATO was formed to maintain a balance of power, to make sure that the Soviet Union didn't control too much or all of Europe. And this is an old-fashioned idea, as I said, going back centuries, that the British and then the Americans were keen to make sure that no power controlled all of Europe. But what's different now, what's different in the 40s and on, is that the balance of power could change without war. It could change at the ballot box. It could change if public opinion changed. And in the aftermath of the Second World War, with these Western European people so broken, quite fairly, by the war, the belief was that if a crisis came, the people of Europe would ask their leaders to concede, to give up some national interests rather than to face crisis or conflict with the Soviet Union. So we have this mix of the old balance of power with the new, the power of people, the age of democracy. NATO is not an alliance of democracies. In one sense, it's insurance for democracies. It's insurance for states who know they can rely on their partners even if their own people are asking them to concede in a crisis. So NATO is built then in 1949. By 1955, West Germany has joined the alliance, and the Soviet Union is going to create its own Warsaw Pact, its own alliance in the East. And here the Cold War freezes. The Soviets change their tune. They stop making too many bullying requests against other states. There are still a few. And they start accusing NATO of being a pro-war alliance. And the Cold War freezes. The Cold War freezes along these divisions. And the question from 1955 on is it frozen because Joseph Stalin has died? Is it frozen because the Soviets never really had aggressive intentions? Or is it frozen because NATO is working? Right? It's possible to prove the negative in this case. And Allied leaders believed that the peace that came from the 50s on was the result of NATO, but they could never prove it. How do you prove this to your people? And the question then that's with NATO from the 50s all the way to today, I would argue, is NATO still necessary, or has it put itself out of business? So it's built, but then I want to talk about how NATO is maintained in spite of the fact that it's very difficult to prove that it's actually doing something. And the other element of NATO is that it relies on nuclear weapons. It relies very much on the nuclear arsenal of the United States. And so I want to do something that's a little bit unusual to try and think about the connection between nuclear strategy and democracy. And there is a connection here. It starts really with the Cuban Missile Crisis. If we can fast forward to 1962, John F. Kennedy is president. He learns that the Soviet Union has sent nuclear missiles to Cuba, and he successfully negotiates with the Soviets to have those missiles removed. Right? It's an amazing diplomatic moment, but it's a diplomatic moment, an American diplomacy backed up by military force. Because what makes Kennedy's position so strong is that he's mobilizing reserves. He's putting nuclear forces on alert. Right? He had an extremely strong negotiating hand because of the American force he had behind him. And at that time, if we take just a quick map, the United States was really the dominant nuclear power in Europe. The United States had smaller tactical nuclear weapons in Europe. That's the very smallest tactical nuclear weapon you could ever imagine down there. It's a real weapon that were deployed in Europe to face off against the Red Army, and the forces were essentially matched in Europe. But on the larger strategic plane, the United States with its bombers and then soon missiles just had the nuclear upper hand over the Soviet Union in 1962. But that's going to change, and that's going to change partly as a result of their humiliation at Cuba. The Soviets launched this crash program to develop their own strategic nuclear capability. It's already online, but they throw all of these resources in it. And we are going to get, by the late 60s, early 70s, into what you may remember as MAD, mutually assured destruction. Right? Both states could destroy each other strategically. Both states could target each other's homeland. But the Soviets went further. By the late 1970s, they introduced two new types of weapons that upended this balance in Europe. It's a new bomber and a new missile that represents an intermediate range weapon. These are the intermediate range nuclear forces that have been in the news this year. The Soviets developed a new weapon that could not reach the United States, but could absolutely destroy Western Europe. And it threw off this balance. It caused quite a bit of fear in Europe fear both as to what the Soviets were planning, why did they want to be able to hold Western Europe hostage, in a sense, with these weapons, but their real fear, the Europeans' real fear, was that the Americans would not use their own weapons in case of war, that effectively, where the Soviet Union and the United States were equal, would cause the United States to simply stand back from any conflict. In the sort of arcane terminology of nuclear strategy, this gave the Soviet Union escalation dominance. They had something that couldn't be matched by the other side, and it really frightened the Europeans. Not because they thought the Soviet Union was going to destroy Western Europe, but because it gave them a bargaining chip. It gave them a chance now to bully Europe again. The Americans studying this come to realize what's happened. The Soviets are creating the possibility of a Cuba in reverse. The Soviets are trying to create the same conditions that the Americans had used so effectively in the 1960s. And so in the late 70s, there are all sorts of worries. How can NATO conquer this new threat? And in 1979, they come up with quite an ingenious idea. They're going to deploy their own intermediate-range nuclear forces. They agree in 1979 to deploy them in 1983 if the Soviet Union hasn't got rid of their weapons. The hope is that this whole class of weapon system can be traded away. And I think if you put it like this, it just makes sense. Okay, states will go one for one and match each other's capabilities. The problem, though, was that nuclear weapons were extremely unpopular in Europe at this time. Between 1979 and 1983, there were enormous protests in Europe against the deployment of these weapons. We had protests at German air bases. These are women of Greenham Common chaining themselves to the fence at a US air base where missiles would be deployed. The challenge to NATO's strategy here wasn't the Soviet Union. Right? The strategic planners could match that. They could just deploy their own missiles. The challenge was the people of NATO, especially in Europe, who didn't want these weapons on their soil at all. And what's fascinating, I think, is that many of these people, I mean, it's an honorable position. They thought these weapons were unacceptable. But of course, this was a very convenient position for the Soviet Union. And so the Soviet KGB and the East German Secret Service funneled money into the anti-nuclear protests in the late 70s and the early 80s. The protests would have happened anyway, but they were bigger and had more bang because the Soviets were encouraging them. And the Soviets recognized that the challenge to NATO was best targeted at the people of NATO. That was the button that the Soviet Union could push. And these are the active measures that Russia uses today, right? When they're working on influence operations, they are working to find divisions in society, not to create divisions, but to find divisions and to multiply them, to magnify them. But the INF story has a happy ending, or at least it did until this year. When Ronald Reagan became president, he agreed with Mikhail Gorbachev, the Soviet leader, to eliminate intermediate-range nuclear forces, and they signed this treaty in 1987. So it came true, right? Reagan hated nuclear weapons. Many NATO officials hated nuclear weapons. They thought they were awful. They thought, like their people, they were evil. But where protesters thought nuclear weapons were evil, NATO leaders thought they were a necessary evil. They're what they needed to use to maintain the strategic balance. And then Reagan could come through with this remarkable moment and negotiate them all away. It's an incredible diplomatic achievement again. Unfortunately, it's been clear that the Russians have been cheating on this treaty. The United States is also interested in having this capability in Asia, and so the US withdrew from this treaty this year, and in all fairness, withdrew after realizing that the Russians were cheating on it. So intermediate range weapons, totally off the earth from 1987 on, will be back, and they'll be back in the news. So a careful balancing act to maintain NATO, and the balance is between what NATO leaders thought was necessary and what their people thought was necessary. But let me move forward then to the end of the Cold War. To the end of the Cold War in the late 1980s. More protests, but protests of a different sort. Right? Enormous outpouring of protests in Germany. In 1989, the East German regime had sealed its borders to try and staunch the outflow of refugees, the people fleeing East Germany. And East German citizens protested the border closings in these massive demonstrations. As Jeffrey Engel has written, this is not long after Tiananmen Square, the same year as Tiananmen Square. These are very tense times, right? No one knows just what's going to happen in 1989. NATO war planners are worried that the Soviet Union is going to send troops to Berlin or to support the East Germans. There's a document, a NATO document, that shows the worry in 1989, this fear that a crisis in Berlin in 1989 will lead to the World War III scenario for which NATO has always planned. Enormously tense times, and yet, on a surprisingly peaceful night in November 1989, the wall is open and protesters will tear it down. And they're going to reduce to rubble this great symbol of a divided Germany, this great symbol of the Cold War. And it's going to be the start of massive changes in Eastern Europe. All of those states that had come under Soviet influence in the 40s, that had been a part of the Warsaw Pact, they're now going to pick new leaders. That whole Warsaw Pact alliance is going to crumble. Ultimately, of course, the Soviet Union is going to crumble into independent republics. And in 1989, 1990, 1991, there is this question, is NATO still necessary? Or now that the Cold War is over, can NATO be dismantled? Can NATO end? And ultimately, through a conscious choice, careful study, NATO leaders are going to agree to keep NATO in place. Not only to keep it, but to expand it. And this is because NATO was not only a Cold War tool, but it had become really the fundamental pattern for organizing European security. It was the security system in which all of these states had essentially grown up after their destruction during the Second World War. Brent Scowcroft, who's George H.W. Bush's national security advisor, wrote George H.W. Bush, a memo worrying or pointing out that if the people of Western Europe, the people of the United States and Canada, think that only peace is at hand, that there is no more chance of conflict, they'll ask their governments to lower their defense spending and NATO would fall apart. And what Scowcroft writes is that if this happens, if NATO falls apart, there would be instability on a scale not seen since the aftermath of World War II. It would be right back to those problems of the 1940s. And there were real worries in their minds as to what would happen in Europe, right, with this Warsaw Pact crumbling. Can I just ask you what time it is, Jeff?
It is 6:45.
Great. My watch stopped in a seminar last week, and I accidentally kept my students half an hour late, and so I want to make sure that I don't do the same thing. It was very unpopular last class of this semester. They're very kind. They didn't get up. They could have left, but great. Okay, my watch is still going, so thank you. I just want to make sure. The Allies had these two main worries at the end of the Cold War. First, Germany. What would be Germany's future? West Germany and East Germany were unified in 1990. Well, the last time there'd been a unified Germany in Europe, there had been real problems, right? Germany had been at the heart of the origins of both the First and the Second World War. There were major concerns in Western Europe, especially those states that had been in the past occupied by the Germans, as to just what an independent Germany meant. When Germany joined NATO, West Germany joined NATO in 1955, the Germans agreed not to build their own nuclear weapons. They agreed not to form their feared German general staff again, and they agreed to real limits on the size of their army and their navy. And so in the Cold War, the German military, the German security system had been built into NATO. It was a part of NATO. And it's for this reason that President Bush would tell Margaret Thatcher that NATO was fundamental, indeed more important than ever, even after the end of the Cold War. It was a home for Germany. The second worry was, what about all of these states that had been a part of the Warsaw Pact? Where would they look to for security? What would they do? Would they ask for alliances with other states in Europe? Would the Poles ask for a treaty with France, perhaps? Well, that had happened before, and it wasn't a success either. Right? Leaders who knew about the diplomacy of the 1930s were extremely worried that a new rickety system of bilateral alliances would spring up in Europe. They knew that even though the Soviet Union would ultimately collapse, Russia still was a nuclear power. Russia had always had interests in South and Southeast Europe. The Germans and the Russians had squabbled with each other over Eastern Europe for over a century. What could solve these problems? Well, the answer, of course, is NATO. Right? By keeping NATO intact, it provided this home for Germany. And President Bush invited the German Chancellor Helmut Kohl to Camp David and offered him a quid pro quo. It's very much the stuff of international diplomacy then as now. And the deal was the United States would be a champion of German unification if it remained in NATO. And Kohl accepted, and that was the deal. So NATO as a home for Germany. But NATO could also offer solutions to the security problems in Eastern Europe. And even in the first year after the fall of the Berlin Wall, American officials were thinking about how the United States and later NATO could solve the security dilemma for these states of the Warsaw Pact. And already in 1990, the leaders of Czechoslovakia, Poland, and Hungary would ask to be admitted to NATO. And by 1999, they would join the alliance. Right? They were eager to ensure they never came under the control of Moscow again, and their inclusion in NATO solved some of these security worries. And those are the first three states that are going to join NATO after the end of the Cold War, but they're going to grow and grow and grow. You can see this is the dividing line of Europe during the Cold War, and this is now NATO's border today. So NATO has grown incredibly, right? And we can talk about that in the Q&A because it certainly does raise some new questions about international affairs. But my point is, after even the fall of the Berlin Wall, leaders believed that NATO was still necessary and, in fact, that it needed to grow. Okay, so where does this leave us today? Where does this leave us today with this expanded NATO? Well, even though it's easy to think of Europe as a peaceful place, military force just continues to play a part of the diplomatic equation in Europe. Right? And some of the tools and methods of the Cold War are very much in existence today. I mean, there is obvious value to Moscow and Mr. Putin in challenging his neighbors. He continues to flex Russia's military might on the borders of these independent states, some of which are in NATO and some are not. But that's why I always make this mistake, I'm sorry. That's why Russia now has brought back these intermediate range nuclear forces, why they roll these missiles to the border of the Baltic states and to the borders with Poland. They continue to stage massive exercises on the borders of the Baltic states. They have simulated these Russian attacks on Norway. Norway is a member of NATO, and there are also a number of practice nuclear strikes, simulated nuclear strikes against Sweden. Sweden is not a member of NATO, but I can tell you that these events have certainly caused more and more Swedes to become interested in NATO membership. This fascinating continuity between the Cold War and today. And if I can just give you this quick list of events. Events in which there were real crises in the alliance, questions as to whether NATO could continue, and then Moscow has made decisions that proved the alliance must continue. In 1956, there was the Suez Crisis. Major disagreement between the British and the French on one side and the Americans on the other. Within the same month, Soviet tanks rolled into Hungary, proving the need for NATO. In 1968, Soviet tanks rolled into Czechoslovakia, helping to undo some of the disagreements in the alliance that had to do with Charles de Gaulle and the French. In 1979, after all this brouhaha about intermediate-range nuclear forces, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. In 2014, when NATO was at a real low point in terms of popular opinion and defense spending, Putin annexed Crimea. And so one British diplomat in the midst of the Cold War, but it still applies today, said every time NATO is in trouble, the Soviets come along and save it. Right? And so there is this pattern of events, which raises this real question as to where NATO would be today if it had not been for 2014 and Crimea. The main question facing the alliance today is similar to the Cold War in that it's a question about internal unity. Will the NATO allies stick together? I already mentioned French President Emmanuel Macron and his comments about the alliance. President Trump frequently attacks the alliance, but then also supports the alliance. So just the last week before Prime Minister Trudeau is very ungracious in his remarks, the president, they had planned that leaders' summit to be short, to be 2 hours, so that nobody could mess it up, right? They had planned it perfectly. They had all of these documents to show that NATO allies were spending in response to Trump's requests. It was almost perfect, and then you know what happened with that video, the sort of locker room video of people talking about the president. It was a disaster. I personally don't think that the president has really strong feelings about the alliance or NATO, but his rhetoric is concerned with other political calculations he's making. But that in itself is significant. I think he's the first president not to have a major connection or at least intellectual belief in the purpose of the alliance. And this is important because NATO, if you think back to 1949, it was built as a symbol. It was built to reassure allies. And when you start to challenge or question or talk about degrading a symbol, then that in itself is symbolic. Right? And ending NATO, especially without a new system in place, would just raise all of these questions that NATO had solved. Where would the Poles look for their security? Would it be a signal that they needed to deal with Moscow? Where would the American people look in the world if the United States relinquished one of its biggest and long-standing commitments? And what would the Germans do to assure their security? So this is not the position of the Federal Republic of Germany. It's political scientists and others who are writing about this. But in this fearful time of wondering whether the alliance will survive, Germans have to start asking questions about what they will do in a Europe in which they're not protected by NATO. Right? And every once in a while, every couple of decades, when the alliance is in trouble, Germans start asking if it's time to build a nuclear bomb. So it's fine to believe, I think, that NATO might not be the best solution going forward. It might not last forever, but I sure hope that we come up with a different solution rather than just getting rid of it. Ultimately, and just let me conclude by saying that for 70 years then, the alliance turned 70 last April, it's been this, consistent, it's represented this consistent appreciation by NATO's leaders that military force, and especially the US commitment to Europe, was necessary to keep the peace there. That the deployment of troops, of tanks, even of nuclear weapons, even if they weren't fighting, especially if they weren't fighting, were shaping the politics and security of Europe. Right? Those forces helped ensure or protect national leaders from their own people, in a sense. People who, if a crisis came, would choose peace at any price. There's no appetite for war. And this rests on that fundamental assumption made by those men at the end of the Second World War. And I'll give Bernard Montgomery on the left the last word here. He wrote that the men of his generation who had fought in the war wanted peace above all. But as he put it, peace in the modern world cannot be assured without military power. That fact might be sad, but it is true. Peace is, in fact, a byproduct. And it's that idea that's kept NATO alive for 70 years, and hopefully more. So thanks very much. Thanks, John.
I'll let Professor Sayle ask or answer his own questions, pick his own questions. As always, we have microphones on either side. Please, if you would, wait for the microphone so we can make sure that we record your words for posterity.
Certainly. Oh, hello. Hi. Hi, sir. Yes. Hi.
Yeah, great talk.
Thanks.
I just have a couple of very to-the-point questions, I think. The first is the political viability of NATO as we get further and further away from World War II and the Cold War. Perhaps as a result of our rapid expansion of it after the end of the Cold War, I'm just beginning to wonder if the American people, how they would react to a crisis in, for instance, Estonia. Would they risk a war with Russia for Estonia? Those at least who know where Estonia is. And in addition to that, looking at it from a Russian perspective, NATO was an anti-Russian alliance when it was formed, or anti-Soviet alliance. And it has crept ever closer to Russian borders. Now, trying to look at it from the standpoint of a Russian, I might wonder why this is happening, and whether or not they're what we perceive as aggressive efforts, they might look upon as irredentist efforts to recover areas they had had for hundreds of years. I'm not advocating.
No, it's a great question. Yeah, it's a really important question. They're both really excellent questions, so thank you very much. The generations question is a really great question and an important one. And interestingly, it's been with the Alliance for a long time. In the late 60s, there was this fear that there was a generation coming to age who had not fought or lived through the Second World War. So there was a real fear of this successor generation, that these folks starting to vote in the mid-60s just wouldn't get power politics. And this was a real fear. And I'm not sure that NATO came to a great solution to that problem. But what's remarkable is that when Robert Gates, Secretary of Defense Gates, was leaving the Obama administration, he gave a speech in which he said, it's that generation coming of age that didn't live through the Cold War who just won't get NATO. So there has been this remarkable kids these days fear within the alliance, and it's gone on for a long time. And I think that during the Cold War, perhaps, the nature of the Soviet Union was such that NATO didn't think it had to explain itself. And I think that if NATO is going to continue, it needs to explain itself. It needs to explain what it's doing. NATO started to do more public relations campaigning, but I would really like to see NATO allies and NATO leaders getting out there and making the case as to why NATO matters. Because without that, I think you're exactly right. It won't be a concern. As for a particular crisis, what's fascinating is that the Baltic states, let me go back to our map. I know you all know where they are, but I'm just going to put them here. Where did I go? What did I lose them? Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. After 2014, NATO sent brigade groups to Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. I believe the and Poland. The Americans lead the group in Poland, and Canada, of all places, which is off the map, commands the brigade group in Latvia. And there's British troops there. There are Allied troops marbled throughout the Baltics. Why are they there? Well, the operation is called, Canadian operation is called Operation Reassurance, but in the secret documents, of course, the NATO troops have always served as tripwires, in a sense. Right? And if there was really a violent conflagration in the Baltics, American and Canadian troops would be killed. And the calculation of NATO since 1951 was that that would bring in the power of the United States. Very grim, but this is how presidents talked about it during the war. So, but really though, I think we shouldn't expect war or conflict there. What those troops do is what NATO has done throughout the Cold War, which is to convince the Estonians, the Latvians, and Lithuanians that the next time there's a Russian exercise on their border and a Russian demand for some economic or diplomatic concession, the Baltics don't feel like they have to give in because they're a part of an alliance. That said, if you look at the map, the gentleman's exactly right. I mean, where is this alliance going? It's going east and east and east. And it's getting closer and closer to Russia. It includes part of the former Soviet Union. Right? The Baltic states were part of the USSR, and they're now a part of NATO. I don't think the diplomacy of NATO expansion was handled particularly well, and there may have been things that NATO could have done better to calm Russian fears. And yet, it was the position of the Soviet Union, and formerly the position of Russia, that states are independent and can join whatever alliance they choose. This is why Mikhail Gorbachev didn't object to a unified Germany remaining a part of NATO. So there's an official sort of Russian position. States are independent and can make choices, right? And of course, NATO relies on that. When the Poles said, we would like to join NATO, who are the Western allies to say no? And yet, despite that sort of diplomatic assurance from Moscow, there's also clearly the strategic interest that says no, somehow the great powers or other states should decide how independent states operate. So there's an inconsistent Russian policy. There's no doubt that this irritates Putin. But the Russians, I think, really have to decide which side of the mouth they're speaking out of, and decide whether they're going to live up with their international obligations or not on this. So it's a tricky question, but one that the Russians are not making any easier for anyone.
That NATO will be interacting with the European Union as the European Union moves closer to having an integrated European army?
It's a great question. Yeah, thanks a lot. So the question is, what about the relations between NATO and the European Union? Every once in a while, there are ideas for a European army. And the first one was raised in 1950, actually. The French president, or prime minister, excuse me, suggested a European army. And this idea has come up again and again. This is actually something I deal with quite a bit in my book. In the 50s and 60s, the United States supported this idea of Europe coming to defend itself. In the early 1970s, when Europe was really making inroads on establishing a common foreign policy, it was during the Nixon administration, that European policy was clearly, if not anti-American, if not pro-American, sorry, what am I trying to say? It wasn't anti-American, but it certainly wasn't pro-American. Okay, the Europeans were very much against Vietnam, and they were organizing an economic policy that would have made Europe an economic competitor to the U.S. It's early 1970s. Kissinger and Nixon decide to do what Kissinger calls bust Europe. They bust Europe, and one of my chapters is called Busting Europe, and it explains the enormous pressure that the Americans brought to bear on different European capitals to ensure that Europe didn't develop as a really powerful independent actor in your international affairs. Why? Because they didn't think that the Europeans would do it or could do it well. Their history suggested otherwise. And also their real fear was that if Europe emerged as a strong power in and of itself that was in any way a competitor to the United States, including economically, then the people of the United States would see Europe as competition and ask why American troops were being sent effectively as hostages to Europe. So there's a calculation made in the 1970s that Europe should not be responsible solely for European defense. It had to occur within NATO under American leadership. And that policy continues. It was extremely clear in 1991. The Americans, even after the end of the Cold War, when the French suggest this new idea, the Americans say no, the defense of Europe must be coordinated through NATO. And that's the American position today, too. So yes, the Americans ask the Europeans to do more, but not to manage their own defense. And in this world today, managing your own defense means managing your nuclear capabilities. And the idea of a European nuclear deterrent is not popular in Washington. It's not popular in a lot of places in Europe either. So I think that the Americans and different Europeans will continue to resist the idea of Europe becoming an independent sort of military force. It's a great question, though. Thanks. Yes, sir. Hi.
A great talk, as are all the talks produced by Jeff Engel. Could you comment about the place of Turkey in NATO, the only Islamic nation, the only one that's buying serious armaments from Russia, creating problems for us in Syria now as well? So.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's good to come to Dallas where all the tough questions are. This is a very, very tough question, a great one. So I actually think that of all of the issues facing NATO this year, be it the president and people's remarks about the president or the French president's remarks in The Economist, it's actually Turkey that's been the most worrying for the alliance. And I certainly don't have a solution to that. But as a historian, I will take solace in sort of saying, it's always been this way. In fact, in 1952, that's when Turkey and Greece joined the alliance, the Turks were very clear. The Turkish diplomats in Washington were very clear. They wanted into NATO, and if they weren't going to get into NATO, then they might be able to find their own agreements with Moscow. So the Turks have been playing this game, some Turkish leaders have been playing this game for a very, very long time, 67 years, I guess. And so Turkey, extremely important strategically because of its location, because it is a home to US nuclear forces, and because it has an enormously large land army. My hope, I guess, is that, like so many problems with different allies, this one will continue to, the alliance will just muddle through this. It's the only hope I see at the moment. That's not a great policy advice, just muddle through. But an example would be that just at this most recent leaders meeting, the Turks insisted they would not allow NATO to go forward with certain defense plans for the Baltics unless they had support in Syria. They were going to stand in the way of NATO's European defense mission unless the allies agreed with their assessment of the Kurdish militias. This hit the news, and by the end of the summit, or the leaders' meeting, I should say, Turkey had given up on that demand. So this was managed in a back room somehow, and NATO was able to muddle through. But when you have this many states, there are so many disagreements. I mean, Turkey and the United States have been at odds before, too. Of course, Turkey refused passage of U.S. troops in 2003 in the invasion of Iraq. It's a real crisis between the states, and yet carried on. So a very, very difficult and thorny issue. That's my answer.
Thank you for
Thanks. Yeah, so another fantastic question. The relationship and the future of NATO-Chinese relationship, or what is NATO's mission in regard to NATO? I think that if you ask 29 different defense ministers in NATO, you would get 29 different answers. The alliance does not agree on its relationship or its role, or whether it even has a role in relation to China. What's fascinating here is that, again, this was an issue that some people saw on the horizon as early as the 1960s. French President Charles de Gaulle reached out to the Soviet Union, and he told his NATO colleagues that in the future, China will be the threat to North America and Western Europe, and so we should work with the Soviet Union now to conquer China later. And I think a lot of people thought he was out of his mind to say such a thing. But now, of course, China has emerged as this remarkable power. I would say that it will be very hard for NATO to come to a solution because so much of the competition and challenge coming from China is economic. And although the NATO allies have always worked together fairly well on defense issues, they have, as states, never been good at agreeing to take economic steps together. They just have different markets, they have different economic goals, and so NATO had a very hard time forming sanctions and other things, even against the Soviet Union, which they all agreed was their enemy. So trying to tackle China in any sort of non-military way, in economic or political cooperation, is going to be a challenge. I mean, a great example here would be so Canada has arrested a Huawei Chinese telecom executive at the request of the United States, and in response, China is holding 2 Canadian citizens hostage without trial, just holding them. And the alliance, NATO, is not coming together in any way. The Canadians are often out asking for sort of an allied front on this, that China shouldn't be taking hostages, and yet they are. So there's so many ways in which it's too difficult for these allies to come together, even on something that you'd think was pretty basic, like not to be taking hostages from allies. But I think it would take a major crisis in Asia for the allies to come together. Great. So I'm not sure where there's a mic coming this way.
Thank you, Professor, for the great talk.
Thanks.
Are you ready for a softball question?
Try me, sure.
But recently, Macron has complained that every time he sits down with the Americans to talk about NATO, we bring up the finances.
Yeah.
What are his arguments, and also Trudeau's arguments, since France and Canada are not paying their share?
Yeah, so this is a really great question. This is sometimes called burden sharing. This is a question about finance. So the most important thing to say, I guess, off the bat is just to break apart some of the myths in the newspaper. So states pay a very, very small amount of money to NATO itself. It's infinitesimal, and the United States, though, as always with these things, has always paid the largest share. And NATO has agreed that the United States will no longer not pay the largest share of NATO financing. So keep like the headquarters going, to keep a few infrastructure projects going. What we talk about when we talk about NATO spending is really how much states spend on their own defense, because it's all of the states' individual defense spending that makes up NATO. So in 2014, after Crimea, the Allies all agreed that they would spend 2% of their GDP on defense spending. So they would increase their national defense spending. At that time, only 3 states met the 2% fraction. Now, as of just this recent leaders meeting, I believe 9 states are up to that 2%. But all of the NATO allies agreed to meet this level of defense spending within 10 years. I should be clear, so it's been 5 years, and some of them have got there. But it's very unlikely that the other states are going to get to 2% in the next 5 years. They made a commitment, and they agreed to a statement to which they're not living up to. And in a world where a lot of the European allies and Canadians are really keen on talking about people living up to commitments, I think it's, a little bit concerning that they're not living up to their own. What those states would argue, I guess, is that they make up in other ways. And so the Canadians always point to the fact that there are Canadians in Latvia leading a brigade group there, and that it's not how much you spend, but what you do with it. So I'm sympathetic to the argument that you shouldn't make a commitment and not live up to it. I'm also sympathetic to this argument it's sort of where you put your action that counts. And I think that NATO really needs to figure out a better way of measuring these things. Not bringing it down to make it acceptable what people are doing, but finding a new way of indicating what people are contributing to the alliance. I just think the way we talk about it and the way that states themselves have talked about it is not that helpful. That said, the president has been calling for states to do more, and some states are doing more. It's not only because of the president. The increase in spending, as I said, started in 2014 because of Crimea. But the NATO allies are very happy now to say, Mr. President, we're responding to your requests and we're spending more money, even if they agreed to it beforehand. But the key here is Germany. And Germany doesn't meet its 2%, but Germany has promised to eventually meet its 2%, and it is showing a real change. And I think where Germany goes, other states will go, and it's the most important bellwether of what's happening in the line. So you have NATO allies not living up to their commitments. Those commitments, though, are maybe not the best way of measuring how states participate. And I think that an American position continuously calling on the other allies to do more is right, but there's a very delicate balance at which case it becomes transactional. And so I think the US president or his successors should just be mindful of how that's heard in Europe. Overall, though, I think it's been effective to be sort of banging that drum of spending more money.
I gotta finish with one question.
Oh, no.
It's an easy one. So, Thucydides points out that alliances are not made by mutual interest. They're not made by mutual values. They're made by mutual adversaries. That, in essence, NATO, in that sense, has always been drawn together by the Soviet fear, as you point out, and the Russian fear. There's a recent poll that has been making the rounds this last week that pointed out that in not a majority, but in a not insignificant number of NATO countries, when asked the question, which country is the biggest danger to global security, the answer was the United States. Expound.
Great. Thanks a lot, Jeff. Really appreciate it. So, yes, the fears of the Soviet Union built NATO and kept it together. And this is it's in the book, but it's in all the documents in the British archives and everywhere else. There was another fear that kept NATO together. And one British diplomat said, we must keep it in mind, but never speak it aloud, and that's Germany. There's real fear and concern about Germany's place in Europe. Not because people don't like Germans. People always, the diplomats would say, oh, we like this chancellor. It's the next chancellor that we're worried about. And so there are people, with living memory of German occupation in Europe. And so Germany does help balance the alliance and hold it together. So it's not just the Soviets. It's also the Germans, but it's also what Russia does on its borders, on the borders of allied states. So those two things still exist. As for the United States, there is an enormous amount of what I would say chatter and noise about the American position on NATO. And I think that comes largely because the president's comments and tweets get a lot of attention, and they're important. They're a part of presidential history, of course, so we'll be studying them and have postdocs that study the president's tweets. But there's another level to American policy, which is what the United States actually does on the world stage. And in this case, there is increased, not continued, but increased deployment of American troops to Europe. They still hold command positions. They still send troops. They still command that brigade in Poland. So there's one level of rhetoric, but the level of American action in Europe remains extremely high. And I think that is what the Europeans are watching. And if that changes, if you start hearing about American troops coming home, then you should start looking for those headlines about a European army, about a German nuclear weapon, about some new policy for the organization of European defense. So there's a difference between what the United States says and what it does, and right now it's still, the leader of the alliance. Okay? Great.
Now,
On board. Never come talk to your old boss.
Tim, let me point out that, as is our tradition, we have books for sale. This time we decided to give the book sale to Interrobang, our good friends independent store that, of course, had a little bit of difficulty earlier this year, shall we say. Unfortunately, they're having a really bad year because the books didn't come in because of snow in Minnesota. So they are going to have tomorrow morning 40 copies of Tim's book. Go to their new location on Lover's Lane. Say hi, become familiar, bring home a book. Thank you, Tim.
Thanks a lot. Thank you.